Hey guys, welcome back. Today, continuing the Flood lore series, we are taking a look at the Flood forms that sadly never made it into the games, the ones that Bungie left behind on their great journey. And yes, this does include the elusive Juggernaut. So let's kick it off with the two known forms that were cut from Halo 2. The first being a really weird variant of the carrier form, the shielded carrier form. Now, although these things can be found deep within Halo 2's code, they clearly never made it that far into development, as you can see, because the model is quite literally just a regular carrier form with a jackal shield stuck to the front of it. Now, depending on how far into development these things were, the shield may have been actually attached to the combat form, or maybe was just a placeholder. Now, the former does kind of make sense, considering that jackals are sometimes used to create carrier forms because of their weak body structure, being far too weak for combat forms. So Bungie could have had the idea that their shield stayed with them as they were infected. This also could make a canonical sense because it's easily explained by the fact that carrier forms are very weak and very vulnerable, and they can often be killed before they actually fulfill their goal of getting behind enemy lines, popping and spreading infection forms. So whacking a massive shield in the front of them would have made that quite a lot easier. However, the latter is always possible, that it was merely a placeholder for some sort of very similar functioning flood shield, maybe comprised of nothing but pure flood biomass. It'd make sense for there to be at least a carrier form variant that had a shield or a defense of some sort, considering how vulnerable they are and how easy it is to just drop one before it can carry out its intended task. So, the Juggernaut, the biggest piece of Halo mythology I swear I've ever encountered. These things clock in at around 17 feet of pure flood biomass and have two massive tentacle arms that they use as both their main method of attack and also defense. Their long, strong legs give them an odd amount of speed, especially for their height, and also the ability to jump pretty damn high, both as a method of movement and also attack. Hidden within the bulky torso of the Juggernaut were a bunch of infection forms that Bungie said acted as the brain of the creature. Now, according to Robert McLeese of Bungie, the Juggernaut is a descendant of Halo 3's pure forms, identical in almost every single way, from gameplay style to biological makeup. Just like the other pure forms, they're formed purely of flood biomass. Now, like I said before, their gameplay mechanics were somewhat similar to the pure forms in Halo 3 as well. They weren't supposed to show up in large numbers like combat forms do, only one at a time, and they acted as a sort of mini Gravemind. Now, what I mean by this is that, likely using its brain of infection forms, it managed to command local combat forms, and when it was killed, all of those combat forms went offline, in Bungie's words, and just died. Now, that's very weird considering, like I said in the other video, they still have infection forms in them, so it suggests that maybe the Juggernaut was intended to control the infection forms that control the combat forms. Fucking Floodception. Originally slated to spawn on the Oracle and Quarantine Zone, McLeese said the reason that they weren't included ultimately was because the supposed intelligence of the pure form was just way too high for what it was actually intended to be used for. It was intended simply to be a flood tank. However, the Flood Abomination boss in Halo Wars 2 is heavily based on it, so our hopes for a canon Juggernaut may have actually been fulfilled. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Alrighty then, the next three forms, ironically, are all from Halo 3. So far we've had 2 forms from Halo 2 and 3 from Halo 3. Nice fucking meme. Anyways, all 3 of these guys are pure forms, the first of which was the Flood Infector form. Now, this is probably the most interesting of the bunch to me. It had 3 legs, or 3 limbs, that, as you can imagine, you could quite easily shoot off to slow it down and make it weaker. However, after around 10 seconds, these limbs would gain the ability to regenerate, which is something that we've never seen a flood form do before, and I bet that the visual effects that Bungie had in plan for these would have been cool as fuck. Its main method of attack was by shooting out flood spores, hence the name. These spores do exactly what an infection form does. They infect hosts and make them into combat forms, so this thing will have likely just acted as a faster and more versatile and agile carrier form, maybe even being a carrier form variant similar to the shielded one. It also looked like it could take control of vehicles, which would have been very weird considering that it doesn't have a humanoid shape like the combat forms, so seeing one of these things drive a warthog, I don't know, it would look kind of weird. However, this piece of concept art showing it actually growing biomass on a warthog, now that looks pretty fucking dope. As disgusting as it looks, I kind of like it. The next one is the stealth form, which looks fairly similar to a Juggernaut, just a lot smaller, but it doesn't do anything like what the Juggernaut was intended to do. This pure form was actually capable of holding weapons, as you can see it here with a plasma rifle, and was likely meant to keep a low profile, as you can see on the left, to maybe try and defeat its enemies using stealth, and to hide in the shadows quite easily. It also kind of looked like it was able to run on all fours too, using its little T-Rex hands and tentacles to make it run a lot faster and to be able to flank enemies and get behind them easier. Sadly though, that's all we know about this form. Maybe in the future 343 will choose to flesh it out when they bring the Flood back. I don't know, maybe they will, maybe they won't, but that's all we know for now. Finally, we have the Flood transport form. Given its use, which we're going to get into in a second, it was likely going to be pretty fucking big. Now this thing has 4 legs and looks a fair bit like the Stalker form. I'd imagine that the Stalker form kind of was created off the back of this thing, as you'll realise in a second. This thing has a bunch of tentacles which were used to collect or recycle biomass, and had an abdomen that acted as a biomass reprocessor, where it could quickly convert either regular or flood biomass that it scavenged in the environment into combat forms, essentially acting like another carrier form variant, so this time, instead of carrying infection forms, it carries combat forms. Now this one was seemingly fleshed out a lot more than the other two, as it even has a gameplay mechanic that was completely conceptualized for it. Its main purpose was to live up to its name by carrying a maximum of 6 unarmed combat forms on its back, and transporting them into battle. However, it had to pass through 4 steps before actually releasing the combat forms. Number 1, it would first scoop up any available biomass in the area, be it a dead combat form or a host. It would then put this biomass inside of it and then recycle it. Then, when enough of it was recycled, the growth pods on the creature's back would grow and start to increase in size, and then when they'd grown enough, it would then spit these growth pods back out at the enemy, acting as a sort of damage-dealing projectile. All in all, pretty fucking nasty, but very interesting from a gameplay standpoint. I would have loved to have seen how these guys actually fit into Halo 3's sandbox, and where they stood alongside the pure forms that we got. So that's it for all of the Flood forms that sadly never made it into the games. Some had some pretty damn unique ideas like the last one, but there were others that were too similar to other forms to be introduced alongside them, sadly. I don't know, like I said earlier, maybe some of these things will get fleshed out a little bit when 343 eventually reintroduce the Flood into the main games. Or, sadly, maybe not. Next time, we are going to look at the elusive Halo Wars Flood forms, of which we really don't know that much about, and then the 4 stages of a Flood outbreak. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, I really appreciate it, and I'll catch you in the next one.